Adrian N. Breitfelder, City Clerk, you are hereby directed to call a special session of the City Council to be held on Monday, November 4th, 2024 at 5:30 p.m. in the historic Federal Building for the purpose of conducting work sessions on Microsoft Copilot implementation and an update on grant initiatives and grant funding.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to a special session of the Dubuque City Council for November 4th, 2024. As a reminder to viewers and listeners, due to the nature of tonight's meeting topic, public input is not accepted. However, you may contact the City Council directly from the city's webpage at www.cityofdubuque.org/council contacts. Attendance for the session is as follows. Mayor Kavanaugh.
Here.
Council members Farber.
Here.
Jones.
Here.
Resnick.
Here.
Roussel.
Here.
Sprank.
Here.
Wethel.
Here.
City Manager Van Milligan.
Here.
And City Attorney Brumwell.
Here.
Thank you. Our first work session topic is Microsoft Copilot implementation. I will turn it over to Chief Information Officer Chris Coleman.
Good evening, everyone. And it's good to kind of talk about AI in a way that hopefully isn't too intimidating or too, if I start to geek out a little bit, I think somebody needs a flag that says, Chris, you're going a little bit deep. But hopefully this won't be that type of a session, because I think the important part is to say that as cool and as new some of these generative AI things are, there is a strategy that goes with them, and there are some things that we need to be cognizant of as both a council and staff before we proceed. So tonight we're going to give a little bit about how we got here, kind of the general state of AI and generative AI, walk through a little bit about what Copilot can offer for the city and for public service and the kind of things that we do. I think most important tonight, in addition to some of the how Copilot works, is going through the principles and policy, and kind of those things that we need to be very aware of that are happening under the hood in order to adequately implement it, so that we're doing it in an equitable way, that we're doing it in a knowledgeable way, in a transparent way. And let's talk about licensing and some of the milestones we have as we move forward. So I think sometimes we look at a term like AI and think it happened in maybe in 2011 when Watson played Jeopardy. And I was honored, if that's a word to say, I met Watson when I was at the IBM labs. Huge server behind glass, but it was, it was a cool moment to say I've met Watson. Actually, we go all the way back to 1950 and say that there was a thought about how can we use machine intelligence that can use repetitive kinds of answers in order to create the illusion of intelligence. Fast forward to about 1966 to 1997, there's what they call an AI winter. There really wasn't a lot of development happening in any great deal until you see some of the things that were either robotic, kind of like the Roomba was all the way back to 2002, Siri 2011, Alexa arrived in 2014. So I think we have a long history that happened between 1950 and 2017, and then this slide really illustrates between 18 and 23, 24 now, where we're at, to say there was some really fast, rapid types of things that were done in various different versions of ChatGPT, which is back to 2018, to fast forward now where we're looking at image and voice and video and those kinds of things, as well as what we're going to talk about tonight is integrating a feature of Microsoft 365 Copilot into the tools and pieces of Microsoft 365 that we have available to all of our users in the city. Some of the trends, and this was looking at quite a few different articles that I think in 2024 are really more than a trend, they're a reality. That mainstream applications, and this includes things that are virtual assistants that help you in various websites. These could be virtual assistants that give you choices for things you want to do with internet things in your home, or these kind of things that we're going to talk about tonight, where mainstream applications like Word and Excel and PowerPoint, Copilot will become part of the fabric of those particular softwares. I think the limits of historical large language models will be pushed. We'll talk a little bit more about what is a large language model in terms of how these kinds of technologies work, but I think that that the AI tools that will be in front of us, they're going to have to solve problems, and they're going to have to be credible, and they're going to have to incorporate the things that people look for in their creative and in their work life: text, images, 3D, audio, physical action, and more. So I think when we look at what the customer will drive, will be everything that we've already seen in wearable technologies, in IoT, but it'll be on steroids and be exponential for what we've got right now. I think, and I don't know if Randy Gale is here, but AI will redefine creative industries. So when we look at graphical kinds of representations, or even the things that are in the world of arts, I think AI will become an integrated part of that. And also, and this is where it's really important for us to look at this as a strategy and part of overall data governance, is AI mandates governance, and humans will have to be in the loop. We're the ones that are going to have to be there to talk about not only transparency, but accuracy, and what kinds of models are we using in the data that's fed to those models to make it credible and usable and serving the public as it should. This is probably the most daunting slide I've ever put in a presentation, but it actually isn't as bad as it looks. I think the important thing, and if there's one takeaway tonight, are the 5 steps that you'd go through when you are actually processing a command into a generative AI model. And as humans that have a variety of ways of communicating, our requests that go into generative AI, like Copilot, need some sort of pre-processing. It has to first go into something we call our graph, which is where we store all of our context. Think of it as sort of your personal store of all of your emails and files and meetings and chats and queries and contexts. This is what lives in the 365 tenant that says about you and kind of what your world looks like in terms of online. So from there, the prompt will go send it to save it there, but it'll also work with a service to ground it. And if I can think of a way to analogize this, there's always a person at a meeting or a gathering that says, "You said this, but I think this is what you meant." And that's really what grounding is all about. So once it's grounded, Copilot sends it off to the large language model. When you're using the free version, it really uses more of what's available on the web, but it could use some of your context that you've had in previous searches and responses that you said were great. And then Copilot receives that large language model response. And the last step, and when we'll talk later about why it's been somewhat of a delay for our type of licensing in the government cloud, is there's a compliance and a purview that says you're not returning any kind of personally identifiable information. Or government has a lot more stringent things, particularly at the federal level, in order of what kinds of information that can come back from a query. So again, this happens extraordinarily fast on extraordinarily large servers, happening all that appears to us in real time, and can be very helpful in terms of how well the large language model has been designed or that we're working off of. One problem, though, that large language models, and this is the second thing that I'd like you to take away tonight, is that large language models have a hallucination problem. Not induced by anything external, but large language models, unlike databases, where if a database is queried to bring something back to you that said, you know, show me all of the orders that ordered a blue sweater, and if there wasn't such a thing as a blue sweater, a database will say, I'm sorry, your query is incorrect. Whereas large language models are predictive, and they'll work off of what they have. And basically the hallucination comes from, if they don't know the answer, they'll make something up. So they may look at other stores that sold blue sweaters. They might look at other, people that like to wear blue sweaters, or maybe a particular individual that wears blue sweaters all the time. So I think when we take this back into the real world, and I talked a bit about this in the memo, that grounding is really designed to prevent any kind of risk. So if I'm worried about blue sweaters and I'm just kind of looking it up for my own knowledge. It's not a big deal. But if I'm using a large language model to look at budget trends, if I'm looking at for ordinances or laws or criminal history or trends of things like that that are super important, that they have to be accurate, this is where we really need to pay attention to what's in the large language model. Or if the large language model is based on what has been historically happening, especially if we're using it in reduce any kind of human resources application. I'm always reminded of the story of the sound of heels on a wooden floor, and any of the musicians probably know what I'm talking about, in that they tried to create a way for musicians to audition for orchestras that were basically agnostic to sex, color, any of those kinds of things. But women and musicians typically wear high heel shoes, so when they'd hear the shoes going across the floor, they would know it's a female that's auditioning. So much like that, a large language model would use what's the past historical history that's happened for, let's say, hiring women in STEM positions or something like that. So again, Microsoft Copilot and Microsoft, I think, has done a very good job of looking at how they can use something called retrieval augmented generation so that it takes it relevant to that task, but it also looks to make sure that we're looking at some kind of accuracy. So again, large language models do not equate to databases. And so I think that's the thing that kind of keep those kinds of things in mind in terms of how the technology works. I'm thankful to Braden Daniels, the data analyst that works in the Office of Shared Prosperity. Braden did a survey of the entire city staff, asking some very high-level questions about AI so that we can create a right set that says, okay, well, how are people using generative AI and how often and those kinds of things. And I thought the results were kind of interesting. We had 108 responses. Of that, relatively about half the folks never use it, and there was a variety of frequency of use by the remainder of the staff that you can see on the screen. There's also a variety of tools that we're seeing that folks are using. I'm not surprised to see ChatGPT be the most popular, since it is kind of one of those things for the masses. But as we'll talk about in a little bit, Copilot is one of those things that, again, because it integrates with a desktop and tools that we're already using, I think it shows leveraging an investment that we've already have that would be make most sense. But again, we're not seeing a ton of use by people that are in the city that are using AI. And last but not least, I thought this was a comforting part of the survey, that when folks were asked, I always verify the accuracy of content generated by AI tools that I'm using, there was a pretty strong and an agreement on this that we could see on the slide. So I think folks are skeptical, they are questioning, they are making sure that things that they're using today, that they are in the realm of being accurate, and that they know they have to check. So we have a ways to go on implementation yet, but I thought these were some interesting ways that we could see how many, and that they're concerned about high-level policy. And the other pieces that I think we look at, and I gave some examples again in your memo, of things that we can look forward to and what makes sense as these early stages of using Copilot. Things such as, that people touch every day, their calendars, their Teams messages. How can we better respond with common responses to folks? How can we assist folks in filling out things like building permits or special events permits even? So creating some of those specialized kinds of co-pilots that are for the things that the city uses beyond just knowledge-based kinds of articles and things like that we have. I thought this quote was very powerful in terms of not only what it said, but kind of at the place we are in terms of our journey on adopting generative AI technologies. This is from the CIO of the city of Boston, who really, I think, are a forerunner in terms of not only use of technology, but also the policy that wraps around it, in this case, generative AI. And I think to summarize, it's a tool. I mean, really, it's a tool that allows us to possibly do our work more efficiently, but we're responsible for the use of that tool. So the analogy that the Boston CIO uses that said, much like autocorrect changes a word in a text or in a document, it's up to us to be responsible for what that text was. We don't blame autocorrect for us not checking it. So it enables our work, but it doesn't excuse the judgment nor our accountability. So I think as I digested that, it really brought home the need for governance and some of the things that I think that where we're at on the journey of generative AI right now. From looking at what the principles are, and I did use a lot of the guidelines from the city of Boston, but I think as we work on policy, and we are in the process of that in the city with the team, that there are really 6 principles, and I think a lot of these are with the toolkit that National League of Cities is working on and providing. But they are empowerment, which what that really means, and a lot of the things I've read in some other policies don't necessarily include this, but I think it's important to say we need to support our staff on their journey of being a high-performance, data-driven government so that they can deliver better, safer, more efficient, and equitable services and products to the residents. We let them go through a period, I shouldn't say let, but we encourage discovery. The second piece of this is inclusion and respect. This is we're stewards of the public and we use AI tools respectively, responsively, and we understand the impact that what our use of it and what the data we're using might be. Transparency and accountability, again, this kind of goes hand in glove with everything we do, but it's an ability to kind of learn collectively, regroup if we have to, and be accountable for the actions that we have. Innovation and risk management, again, a two-sided sword, if you want to call it that. In the realm of innovation, we also have risk, but I think it's a manageable risk on a technology like this. And something you hear me talk a lot about, privacy and security, which again wraps around all this to ensure that we're not releasing any kind of prohibited information or personal private information and things like that. And last but not least, whatever we do is for a public purpose. So any kind of technology that we use, whether we're stewarding data or using a technology like this of generative AI, that's really at the heart and the center of all that we do. So I think these 6 principles will guide as we go forward as a litmus test to say, does this technology meet these 6 things? And this is what it means to an employee. And this is a way for us to account for and explain not only the what, but the how and some of the why. So I think a question that I've gotten asked quite a bit is, well, why don't we have this yet? It's been out in the private sector for quite a while in terms of Copilot being available for Office 365. And I think the answer to that is inherent in how we license Office 365 or Microsoft 365, in that we are in what's called a government cloud community, or GCC. And if you remember the slide where I said this is where all your email and all your queries and all of your Teams chat is kept, that's part of that government cloud community. And we have different rules, again, largely driven by what the federal government is dictating in terms of security, but still things that we need that wrap around that particular environment so that we ensure that we keep the public safety as well as that information that we keep. So Microsoft has to meet certain criteria for that to happen, and I think that's still in process. So we get a better pricing on what we're doing also through volume licensing. And so right now, it's not available to us, but it will be. And I'll show you that timeline, I think, on the next slide. So Copilot is going to be released in 2 different phases. The first phase will be available to us as a government client by end of Q4, which is what we're in now, so it would be released per Microsoft by the end of the year. And this really is the phase of it that, at least on the first 3 bullet points, and probably the last one as well, it really takes the ability to embed within those applications that we're already using. So when I think of our staff that our administrative assistants that are using Word, or some of the things that we're doing with Excel or presentations, Copilot is embedded within those productivity apps, and they really become an assistant for you to say, you know, I'd like to do a chart, and then I'd also like to do a pivot table, and please, you know, make this so that it's a certain font and a certain size. And you'd be guided through doing that without having to have that knowledge. You're still responsible for the data, but the presentation would be controlled by something that Copilot could offer. I think where we can really look at some gains in efficiency is through the Outlook enhancements that would happen. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get emails that have a string of 30 different responses, and I'm looking at it going, okay, I got added at response 28, and so I'm thinking, what is this about? Copilot on the integration with Outlook would summarize those. So give you sort of the executive summary of what's happening in that. The other thing is when we have some very large, complex calendars with lots of teams that are working, this allows the folks that are scheduling those meetings ways of intelligently picking those meeting times and dates for people. So I think that's really going to be an enhancer. As we're not looking at 6 different calendars, we're now able to get a centralized view. Chat and Teams are used extensively in the city. I think when you go to search for where was my comment or my document in one of those meetings, it becomes a little tricky. And so, again, this allows us to manage those conversations, give us some awareness of the context, and I think the other pieces of it is, too, not just the written summary of what I said, but creates a lot better summary of the key points using things like my agenda, my discussions, my pieces that went with the meeting, so that I can get a more comprehensive summary of what happened, what actions, who does what by when, and those decisions made. So I think as we see these kinds of things being integrated within our own environment, I think, remember, one of those trends that we talked about early is it will dictate what software that we're using that also use those kind of things to integrate these kinds of concepts. The second phase is scheduled to come out in March of 2025. And again, this is a full integration, not just the pieces of better searching and better summarizing, but full integration into Teams meetings. And also some of the other pieces that we have, like OneNote, that basically stores notes for meetings or documentation, Stream, which is the video manager, Planner, OneDrive for Business, and Loop, which kind of brings all those contacts and all of the pieces together. And it really says, who do I need to loop in for this particular kinds of decision or document? So where we're at on this journey, and again, policy is being drafted with those components that we talked about, hoping to get this done within the month here. Licensing, I'm being very optimistic that Microsoft will have something available for us in December so that we can start some pilot users, because there will be a cost to this. And I know a question is going to be, what is it going to cost? And that, I don't have pricing yet. I can tell you that it's about $2,200 per year per user on the private sector side. We tend to get a decent discount on it. So again, I can't give that as a final, but by budget, we'll have some of those kinds of things. Pilot use cases, again, allowing folks to discover, think about who's going to be our initial folks that are already using it from the survey, finding the champions within the city. Enterprise licensing will probably be something that we'll be including within our budget. And I made up the acronym, but I think it suffices, that ongoing attention to what I call beeps. And I know when we're warned by something, it's usually a beep. And in this case, the beeps are being aware of bias, being aware of equity, being aware of accuracy, privacy, and security that are happening around the kinds of things that we're implementing on generative AI kinds of applications. So I think it's going to be a great responsibility for all of us in terms of the how, but I think the what is going to also be an incredibly exciting time for us to be able to do some discovery and really see how this can make our organization more efficient, more effective, and truly continue on that journey of being high performance and data-driven. And so with that, I will open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chris. That was very interesting for a start in talking about this. Love beeps, by the way. I think you got a book idea right there, so hang on to that one. Make sure you copyright it quick. I think we have time for probably one comment or question. So, Ms. Farber, I was curious if maybe you wanted to go first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And just wanted to give a shout out to Chris and your team because the thought leadership that you have put behind this documentation and our first look, I think is pretty significant and really does denote best practices that a lot of the cities, including San Diego and Boston, are putting together to formulate. And you will find out next week. The League of Cities is actually going to be publishing our AI pilot strategic document with best practices for all the municipalities throughout the United States. So hopefully that can be something that can be a reference for us as well. And I think what's interesting is that the next iteration will have even more information and more applications because every month there's something new out. So this is moving so quickly, and I think that you're really, by your time frame, very much in advance, and I like beeps as well. And you mentioned for next March about the pilot use cases. Well, I think you noted that we actually have 3. And I think the pilots that we might want to do would be maybe some from the other departments, but I think just for the broader understanding, our pilots are being discussed already, appropriately so. We're the ones that you had mentioned that we have also mentioned in the League of Cities for cybersecurity, streets, and smarter city pilots that we have. So that puts us ahead of the game as well. So I look forward to finding out more about what the budgeting will cost, how many users, and most importantly, the training so that we can demystify. And I always say that it's very important to demystify what AI applications are, not only for the staff, but also for those in the community that are going to look at us and say, gosh, we're using AI within the city of Dubuque, and what does that mean? And what does that mean for me to secure our information, our personal information as well? So it's extremely important to have that transparency and the education, not only internally to city, but externally to the members of the community. So appreciate it very much. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Farber.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say we have a whole lot to learn. I think a lot of us are going to be catching up pretty quickly here as we figure out what this is. And I appreciate the timeline to give us a sense of kind of what you're looking at and how we might be looking at this in use in the city of Dubuque. So thank you very much for the time tonight and for the presentation.